Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, a Popular Outline. 9. Critique of Imperialism. By a critique of imperialism, in the broad sense of the term, we mean the attitude of the different classes of society towards imperialist policy in the connection with the general ideology. The enormous dimensions of the finance capital, concentrated in a few hands and creating an extraordinarily dense and widespread network of relationships and connections which subordinates not only the small and medium, but also the very small capitalists and small masters on the one hand, and the increasingly intense struggle waged against other national state groups are financiers of the division of the world and domination over the countries. On the other hand, because the propertied classes do go over entirely to the side of imperialism. General enthusiasm over the prospects of imperialism, furious defense of it in painting its brightest colors. Such are the signs of the times. Imperialist ideology also penetrates the working class. No Chinese wall separates it from the other classes. The leader of the present-day so-called Social Democratic Party of Germany are justly called social imperialists. That is, socialists in the words, and the imperialists in deeds. And as early as 1902, Hobson noted the existence in Britain of Fabian imperialists who belonged to the opportunist Fabian society. Bourgeois scholars and publicists usually come out in the defense of imperialism in the somewhat veiled form. They obscure the complete domination, and the deep-going roots strive to push specific and secondary details into a forefront, and do their very best to distract attention from essentials by means of absolutely ridiculous schemes for reform, such as police supervisions of the trusts or banks, etc. Cynical and frank imperialists who are bold enough to admit to the absurdity of the idea of reforming the fundamental characteristics of imperialism are a rarer phenomenon. Here is an example of the German imperialist attempt in the magazine archive of the world economy to follow the national emancipation movements in the colonies, particularly, of course, the colonies other than those belonging to Germany. They note the unrest and the protest movements in India, the movement in Natal, South Africa, in the Dutch East Indies, etc. One of them, commenting on the English report of the conference held on June 28th through 30th, 1910, of representatives of various subjects, nations, and races of peoples of Asia, Africa, and Europe who are under foreign rule, writes as follows in appraising the speeches delivered at the conference. We are told that we must fight imperialism, and that the ruling states should recognize the right of subject peoples to independence, and the international tribunal should be supervised the fulfillment of the treaties concluded between the great powers of the weak peoples. Further than the expression of these pious wishes they do not go. We see no trace of understanding of the facts of the imperialism is inseparably bound up with capitalism in the present form, and that therefore an open struggle against imperialism would be hopeless unless perhaps the fight were to be confined to protest against certain of its especially abhorrent excesses. Since the reform of the basic imperialism is a deception, a pious wish, since the bourgeois representatives of the oppressed nations go on further towards the bourgeois representatives of the oppressing nation goes further backwards to severely towards imperialism under cover of a claim to be scientific, that is also logic. Quote, the question as to whether it is possible to reform the basis of imperialism, whether to go forward in the further intensification and deepening of the antagonisms which is engenders are backwards towards allying the antagonisms are fundamental questions, our critique of imperialism, since the scientific political features of imperialism are reaction everywhere and increased national oppression due to the oppression of the financial oligarchy and the elimination of free competition. A petty bourgeois democratic opposition to imperialism arose in the beginning of the 20th century in the nearly all imperialist countries. Kautsky not only did he trouble to oppose was not Kautsky not only did not trouble to oppose was not only unable to oppose the petty bourgeois reformist opposition, which is really reactionary in its economic basis, but became merged with it in practice, and this is precisely where Kautsky and broad international Kautskian trend deserted Marxism. In the United States, the imperialist war waged against Spain in 1898 stirred up an opposition in the anti-imperialists and the last of the Mohicans of bourgeoisie democracy, who declared this war to be criminal, regarded the annexation of foreign territories as a violation of Constitution, declared that the treatment of Aguinaldo, leader of the Filipinos, the American promised him the independence of his country, and later landed troops and annexed it, and jingo treachery. They quoted the words of Lincoln: "When the white man governs himself, that is self-government. But when he governs and also governs others, it is no longer self-government. It is despotism. But as long as all the criticism shrank from recognizing the inseparable bond between imperialism and the trusts, and therefore between imperialism the foundations of capitalism, while in shrank from the joining forces engendered by large-scale capitalism and its development remains a pious wish." This is also a main attitude taken by Hobson in the critique of imperialism. Hobson anticipated Kautsky in protesting against the inevitability of imperialism argument and in the argument necessary of increasing and consuming capacity of the people under the capitalism and petty bourgeois point of view in the critique of imperialism. The omnipotence of the banks, the financial oligarchy, etc., is adopted by the authors I have often quoted, such as Agad A. Lansberg, L. Eschwege, and among the French writers Victor Berard, an author of superficial book entitled England and Imperialism, which appeared in 1900. All these authors, who make no claim to the Marxist contrast imperialism with free competition and democracy, condemn the Baghdad railway scheme, which is leading to conflicts and war, utter pious wishes for peace. This applies also to the compiler and the international stock and share issue statistics and Newmark, who are calculating thousands of millions of francs representing international securities exclaimed in 1912. Is it possible to believe that peace may be disturbed? That is the peace of the enormous figures anyone would risk starting a war. Such simple-mindedness on the part of the bourgeois economists is not surprising. Moreover, It is their interest to pretend to be naive or to talk seriously about peace and under imperialism, but the remains of Kautsky's Marxism when in 1914, 1915, and 1916 he takes up the same bourgeois reformist opinion of view and affirms that everybody is agreed. Imperialists, pseudo-socialists, and social pacifists are on the other piece. Instead of the analysis of imperialism, had an exposure of the depths of the contradictions. We have nothing but reformist pious wish to have them aside to evade them. Here is an example of Kautsky's economic criticism of imperialism. He takes the statistics of the British export and import trade with Egypt for 1872 and 1912 to see the export and import trade has grown more slowly than British foreign trade as a whole. From the Kautsky concluded that we have no reason to suppose that without military occupation the growth of British trade with Egypt would have been less, simply as a result of the mere operation of economic factors. The urge of capital to expand can be best promoted not by the violent methods of imperialism, but by a peaceful democracy. This argument of Kautsky, which is repeated in every key by the Russian armor bearer, the Russian shielder of the social chauvinists, Mr. Spectator, constitutes the basis of Kautskyan critique of imperialism, and that is why we must deal with the great detail. We will begin in quotation from Hilferding, whose conclusions Kautsky on many occasions, and notably in April 1915, had declared to have been unanimously adopted by all socialist theoreticians. I want to say thank you guys for bearing with me. I have dyslexia, so I get some of the words jumbled around here and there. But thanks for coming this far with me. Alright, let's continue. It is not the business of proletariat, writes Hilferding, to contrast the more progressive capitalist policy that of the now bygone era of free trade and hostility towards the state that rely on proletariat and economic policy of finance, capital, and imperialism cannot be free trade, but socialism. The aim for proletarian policy cannot today be ideal for restoring free competition, which has now become a reactionary ideal, but the complete elimination of competition and the abolition of capitalism. Kautsky wrote, with Marxism by advocating to the epoch of finance, capital, a reactionary ideal, peaceful democracy, and mere operation of economic factors for objectivity. This ideal drags us back from monopoly to non-monopoly capitalism and is a reformist swindle. Trade with Egypt or with other colonies or semi-colony would have gone more without military occupation, without imperialism, and without finance of capitalists. Which does this mean? The capitalists would have developed more rapidly, and the competition would have been restricted to monopolies in general, or by the connections yoke, i.e., also the monopoly of finance capital, or by the monopolist possession of colony by certain countries. Kautsky's argument can have no other meaning, and this meaning is meaningless. Let us assume that the free competition without any sort of monopoly would have developed capitalism and trade more rapidly. But this rapidly trade and capitalism development, the greater the concentration of production, the capital gives us rise to a monopoly. The monopolies have already risen precisely out of a free competition, even if monopolies have now begun to retard progress. It is not an argument in favor of free competition, which has become impossible after it has given rise to a monopoly. Even if we are the correct in argument and say the Spectre says the trade of the colonies in Britain is now developing more slowly than the trade with other countries, it does not save Kautsky, for it is also monopoly, also imperialism that is beating Great Britain. Only it is the monopoly and imperialism to another country, America, Germany. It is known that the cartels have given rise to the new and peculiar form of protective tariffs, i.e. goods sustainable for exporting to protected. Ingalls noted in Volume 3 of Capital. It is known, too, that the cartels added finance, capital, and the systems peculiar to themselves that of exporting goods at cut rate prices are dumping, as Ingalls call it, as the English call it, within a given country. The cartel sells the good at the high monopoly prices, but sells abroad and the much lower price to undercut the competitor to large its own production of utmost, etc. If Germany's trade with British colonies is developing more rapidly than Britain's, it proves that German imperialism is younger, stronger, and better organized than British imperialism. It is superior to it, but it is by no means proves the superiority of free trade, for it is not a fight between free trade and protection of colonial dependence, but between two rival imperialisms, two monopolies, two groups of financial capital. A superiority of German imperialism over British imperialism is more potent than the wall of colonial frontiers are the protective tariffs. To use this as an argument in favor of free trade and peace democracy is banal. It means forgetting the essential features and characteristics of imperialism, substituting petty bourgeoisie reformism for Marxism. It is interesting to note that even if the bourgeois economist A. Langsberg, whose criticism of imperialism is petty bourgeois as Kautsky's, nevertheless get closer to more scientific study of the trade statistics. He did not compare one single country chosen at random and one single colony with the other countries. He examined the export trade in the imperialist country with countries which are financially dependent upon it borrow money from it. 2. With countries which are financially independent, he obtained the following results. Export trade of Germany to the countries financially dependent on so we have Germany, Romania, Portugal, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and the total numbers together is 234.8 in 1889, and in 1908 is 451.5. The percent increase is 92%. And to countries financially independent of Germany, Great Britain, France, Belgium, Switzerland, Australia, Dutch East Indies, their total is 1,206.6 in 1889, and in 1908 it's 2,264.4, and it is 87% increase. That's obviously not fair at all. Okay, but back to the reading. Landsberg did not draw a conclusion and therefore strangely enough fail to observe that if the figures prove anything at all, they prove that he is wrong. For exporting to the countries financial dependent on Germany have grown more rapidly and slightly the exports in the countries which are financially dependent. I emphasize the if, for Landsberg's figures are far from complete. Tracing a connection between exports of loans, Landsberg writes, in 1890 through 91, a Romanian loan was floated through the German banks, which had already in previous years made advances on this loan. It was used chiefly to purchase railway materials in Germany. In 1891, German exports to Romania amounted to 55 million marks. The following year, they dropped 39.4 million marks, and the fluctuations to 25.4 million in 1900. Only in very recent years have they regained level of 1891 thanks to the new loans. German exports to the Portugal rose following the loans of 1888 to 21,100,000. 1890. Then in the two following years, they dropped to 16,200,000 and 7,400,000, and regained their former level only in 1903. The figure of German trade with Argentina are also striking. Loans were floated by in 1888 and 1890. German exports are Argentina reached 60,700,000 marks in 1889. 2 years later, they amounted to only 18,600,000 marks, less than one-third of the previous figure. It was not until 1901 that they regained the surpassed level of the 1889, and only as a result of the new loans floated by the state by municipalities, with advances to build power stations and with other credit operations. Exports to Chile, as a consequence of loan, 1889 rose to 45,200,000 marks in 1892, and a year later dropped to 22,500,000 marks. A new Chilean loan floated by the German banks in 1908, and followed by a rise of exports in 84,700,000 marks in 1907, only to fall again to 52,400,000 marks in 1908. From these facts, Landberg draws the amazing petty bourgeois moral of how unstoppable and irregular the exports trade is, and when it's bound up with loans. But how bad is the invest capital abroad instead of naturally and harmoniously developing home industry? How costly are the millions of bakshish and Krupp have to pay our floating foreign loans, etc. But the facts tell us clearly that the increase of exports connected with these three swindling tricks finance capital, which is the concern with the bourgeoisie, the concern of the bourgeois morality, but with skinning the ox twice. First, the pockets and profits from the loan, then the pockets and other profits from the same loan with the borrower used to make purchases from Krupp, are to purchase railway materials from the steel syndicate, etc. I repeat that I do not by any means consider Landsberg figures to be perfect, but I had to quote them because they are scientific than Kautsky's. They are more scientific than Kautsky's and Spectators, and because Landsberg shows the correct way to approach the question of discussing the significance of final capital in regard to sports, etc. One must be able to single out the connection of the exports, especially and solely with the tricks of the financiers, especially with solely with the sale of goods by cartels, especially etc. Simply to compare colonies with non-colonies, one imperialism with other imperialism, one semi-colony or colony, Egypt, which all other countries is to evade and to obscure the very essence of the question. Kautsky's theoretical critique of imperialism has nothing in common with Marxism. It serves only as a preamble to propaganda for peace, unity, opportunists and social chauvinists, precisely to the reason that it evades and obscures the very profound and fundamental contradictions of imperialism. The contradictions between monopoly and free competition which exist side by side with it, between the gigantic operations, the gigantic profits, finance capital, and honest trade, and the free market, the contradiction between the two, cartels and trusts. On the one hand, a non-cartelist industry, and on the other, etc. The notorious theory of ultra-imperialism invented by Kautsky is just as reactionary. Compare his arguments on the subject in 1915 with Hobson's arguments in 1902. Kautsky, quote, "Cannot the present imperialist policy be supplemented by a new ultra-imperialist policy, which will introduce the joint exploitation of the world by internationally united finance capital to the place of mutual rivalries and national finance capitals? Such a new phase of capitalism is at any rate conceivable. Can it be achieved? Sufficient premises are still lacking to enable us to answer this question." End quote. Hobson, quote, "Christendom thus laid out a few great federal empires, which each with a routine of uncivilized dependencies seems to many the most legitimate development of present tendencies in one which would offer the best hope of permanent peace in the assured basis of imperialism." Kautsky called ultra-imperialism a super-imperialism, what Hobson 13 years earlier described as a inter-imperialism, except for coining the new clever catchword, replacing it with Latin prefix by another. The only progress Kautsky made in the sphere of scientific thought is that he gave out as Marxism what Hobson in effort described as a cant of English parsons. After the Anglo-Boer War, it was quite natural for his highly honorable caste to exert this main effort in counsel the British middle class and the workers who had lost many of their relatives in the battlefields of South Africa, who were obliged to pay higher taxes in order to guarantee still higher profits for the British financiers, and the better consolation could there be than the theory that the imperialism is not bad, and that it stands close to inter or ultra imperialism, which can ensure permanent peace, no matter what the good intentions of the English parsons, the sentimental Kautsky, may have been. Only objective to the real social significance of Kautsky's theory is this: it is most reactionary method of consoling the masses with hope of permanent peace being possible under capitalism, by distracting their attention from the sharp antagonisms and acute problem of the present time, the directions towards the illusionary prospects of imaginary ultra imperialism of the future, deception of the masses, which is where the Kautsky's Marxist theory. Indeed, it is also to compare well-known that indisputable facts to become convinced in utterly falsity of the prospects which Kautsky tries to conjure up for the German workers and the workers of the land. Let's consider India and Indochina. It is known that these three colonial semi-colony countries with a population of 6 to 700 million are subjected to the exploitation of finance capital of several imperialist powers: Great Britain, France, Japan, and the USA, etc. Let's assume that these imperialist countries alliances against one another in order to protect or enlarge their possessions, their interests, and their spheres of influence in this Asiatic states. These alliances will be inter-imperialist or ultra-imperialist alliances. Let us assume that all the imperialist countries concluded an alliance for the peace division of these parts of Asia. An alliance would be a alliance of internationally united finance capital. There are actual examples of alliances of this kind in history of the 20th century. The attitude of the powers to China, for instance, we ask, is it conceivable, assuming that the capitalist system remains intact, that there is precisely the assumption that Kautsky does not make, that such alliances would be more than temporary? They would eliminate friction, conflict, and struggles in every form possible. The question has only to be presented clearly for any other than a negative answer to be impossible. This is because the only conceivable basis under the capitalism of the division of the spheres of influence, interests, colonies, etc., is a calculation of the strength of those participating, the general economic, financial, military strength, etc., and the strength of these participants in the division does not change to an equal degree. For even development of different undertakings, trusts, branches in industry, are impossible under capitalism. Half a century ago, Germany was a miserable, insignificant country. If her capitalist strength is compared to that of Britain of the time, Japan was compared with Russia in the same way. Is it conceivable that 10 or 20 years' time relative strength of the imperialist powers will have remained unchanged? It is out of the question. Therefore, the realities of the capitalist system, and not the venal Philistine fantasies of the English parsons, are of German Marxist Kautsky, inter-imperialist or ultra-imperialist alliances, no matter what form they may assume, whether it is an imperialist coalition against another or a general alliance embracing all imperialist powers. Inevitably, nothing more than a truce in periods between wars. Peaceful alliances prepare to the ground of wars, the ground for wars, and in their turn grow out of wars in one condition, the only producing alternative forms of peace and non-peaceful struggle, one and the same basis of the imperialist connections and relationships within the world economics, the world politics, but in order to pacify the world, to work and reconcile them with the social chauvinists who have deserted this side of bourgeoisie. Over Kautsky separates one link of the single chain from another, separates the present peaceful and ultra-imperialist, nay ultra-imperialist alliance of all the powers of pacification of China. Remember the suppression of the Boxer Rebellion, the non-peaceful conflict of tomorrow, which will prepare the ground for another peaceful general alliance for the partition, say, of Turkey, and or the day after tomorrow, etc., etc. Instead of showing the living connection between periods of imperialist peace and periods of imperialist war, Kautsky presents the workers with a life of abstraction in order to reconcile with them their lifeless leaders. An American writer, Hill, in the history of diplomacy in the international development of Europe, refers to the preface of the following periods in the recent history of diplomacy: the era of revolution, the constitutional movement, the present era of commercial imperialism. Another writer divides the history of Great Britain's world policy since 1870 into the world's periods: the first Asiatic period, that the struggles against the Russia's advance to Central Asia towards India; the African period, approximately 1885 to 1902, that of struggle against France and the partition of Africa; the Fashoda incident in 1898, which brought her within hair's breadth of war with France; the second Asiatic period, alliance in Japan against Russia, and the Russian period, chiefly anti-German. The political patrol clashes take place in the financial field, wrote the banker Reiser in 1905, and showing how French finance capital operating in Italy was preparing the way for political alliances of the countries, and how the conflict was developing between Germany and Great Britain over Persia, between all the European capitalists over Chinese loans, etc. Behold the living reality of peace and ultra-imperialism alliances in their inseparable connection with ordinary imperialist conflicts. Kautsky, obscuring as the deepest contradictions of imperialism, which inevitably boils down to painting imperialism in a bright color, leaves its traces in the writer's criticism of political features of imperialism. Imperialism is the epoch of finance and capital and the monopolies which introduce everywhere the striving for domination, for freedom, whatever the political system. And the result, these tendencies is everywhere, reaching the extreme intensifications of antagonisms in this field. Particularly intensifies because become the yoke of national oppression and striving for annexations, i.e. the violation of national independence. For annexation is another, but the violation of the right for nations to self-determination. Hilferding rightly notes the connection between imperialism and the intensification of national oppression in the newly opened up countries. He writes the capital imported onto them intensifies antagonisms and excites against the intruders and constantly growing resistance of the people who are awakening national consciousness. The resistance can be developed in dangerous measures against foreign capital. The old social relations become completely revolutionized. The age-long agrarian isolation of nations without history is destroyed, and they are drawn into the capitalist whirlpool. Capitalism itself gradually provides the subjugated with the means of resources and the emancipation they set out to achieve, goals and once seemed highest in the European nations. The creation of the United National States means economic and cultural freedom. This movement for national independence threatens European capital in the most valuable and most promising fields of exploitation. The European capital can maintain domination only by continually increasing its military forces. To this must be added that it is not only in new opened up countries, but also in old, that the imperialists leading annexation to increase national oppression. Consequently, also to increasing resistance, while objecting to the intensification of political reaction to the imperialism. Kautsky leaves the shade of question what has become particularly urgent vis-a-vis the impossibility of unity with the opportunists in the epoch of imperialism. While objecting to annexations, he presents his objections in the form of the most acceptable and least offensive and opportunists. He addresses himself to the German audiences, yet he obscures the most typical important point. For instance, the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine by Germany. In order to appraise the mental aberration of Kautsky, I shall take my fellow example. I shall let they suppose that the Japanese condemns the annexation of Philippines by the Americans. The question is, will many believe that he does so because he has a horror annexation as such, and because he himself is a desire of annex of Philippines? And shall we not be constrained to admit that the fight the Japanese is waging against annexations can be regarding the being sincere and politically honest? And if we fight against the annexation of Korea by Japan and urge its freedom for Korea to succeed from Japan? Kautsky's theoretical analysis of imperialism, as well as the economic and political critique of imperialism, are permeated through and through with the spirit absolutely inconceivable with Marxism, irreconcilable with Marxism, of obscuring the glossing over the fundamental contradictions of imperialism, and the striving to preserve all the costs and crumbling unity with the opportunism in the European working class movement. And that is it. That's the end. I hope I did Comrade Lenin justice, and I hope you guys enjoyed. Alright. Thanks, guys.